First off, thank you very much to Reza Negarestani for being here, for giving us the chance to hear one of his infamous Skype talks. Adesso parlerò un attimino in italiano, cercando di introdurvi il lavoro di Reza Negarestani molto rapidamente, per poi passare direttamente la parola a Negarestani. Reza Negarestani è uno dei più importanti filosofi del XXI secolo. Il suo lavoro è stato estremamente scarso, comunque estremamente scarno a livello letterario. Di Reza Negarestani abbiamo soltanto 2 libri, ma è stato tra i lavori più forti, potremmo dire, all'interno del dibattito contemporaneo, e uno dei lavori più incisivi e più innovativi all'interno di quella che potremmo considerare la scena filosofica contemporanea. I 2 lavori di Reza Negarestani sono Ciclonopedia, uscito nel 2011, e Intelligence and Spirit, uscito invece l'anno scorso. Ciclonopedia è un'opera ibrida che unisce fiction, horror e teoria critica, che sostiene una tesi paradossale, ossia che il Medio Oriente è un essere senziente. Il Medio Oriente, con il suo petrolio, la sua sabbia, la sua terra, è un essere che ha avuto un impatto terrificante sulla storia globale ed è diventato sostanzialmente una sorta di personaggio concettuale che Negarestani ha deciso di descrivere in quella che China Miéville, uno dei più importanti autori di fantascienza degli ultimi anni, ha descritto come un horror post-genere o un'apocalisse teologica. Reza Negarestani in questo periodo ha cambiato fortemente il suo assetto teorico e oggi ci porterà un talk molto più ispirato al suo ultimo libro, Intelligence and Spirit. La tesi di base di Intelligence and Spirit è quella che lui definisce inumanesimo, ossia che la più grande elaborazione dell'umanismo è in realtà il divenire inumano dell'uomo. Se l'uomo non viene più considerato come un'entità essenzializzata, ossia con una sorta di al suo interno una sorta di spirito in grado di dare la sua natura umana, l'uomo diventa propriamente inumano, diventa quindi una costruzione perpetua di se stesso all'interno della storia, una costruzione razionale, una costruzione potremmo dire storiografica e biografica dell'uomo come specie. Reza Negarestani parte da questa tesi e ha scritto un tomo di 700 pagine che quindi non riassumerò qui. In questo talk ci parlerà invece di qualcosa di forse più semplice da un certo punto di vista, è più vicino a quelli che sono gli interessi anche di molti professori all'interno del nostro dipartimento, ossia il rapporto fra le forme di vita, le Lebensformen di Wittgenstein, e il suo progetto effettivo del neorazionalismo. Non dirò altro perché vorrei passare immediatamente la parola a Negarestani, magari l'approfondimento sul suo progetto più ampio e generale lo lasceremo per le domande al termine, in modo da creare una conversazione con uno degli autori più interessanti sul panorama contemporaneo. Grazie. Reza, you can go.
Okay. First, I would like to start with a synopsis that encapsulates the overall theme of this presentation and the structure of its arguments. In philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein uses the term Lebensform, translated to life form or form of life, only 5 times. Yet, despite this sparing use, the term occurs at key moments embedded within cryptic passages, where Wittgenstein's philosophy of life, philosophy of language, and the life of philosophy twine together. What I'm going to do in this presentation is to elaborate on the concept of life form as employed by Wittgenstein rather than Gambit, in order to show that it both suggests life as a field of possibilities afforded by logic and language, and more importantly, the possibility of rationally imagining and constructing different life forms, Lebensform. Indeed, the question of life form, which is the philosophical question of what life is, already implies the plurality of life forms as constructible and not merely given possibilities. So, If life for Wittgenstein is simply the world, then life form is also a world, insofar as it is what life ultimately is. To speak of life without form, a form that oscillates between material and noetic, that is to say, linguistic, logical, computational poles between sensibility and cognition, is an empty idea, a vitalistic fallacy, so to speak. Now, to the extent that life is a world and it implies the plurality of life forms, it also implies the plurality of not possible worlds of the kind modal realist espouses, but actual worlds, no less actual than the actuality of the world of humans as a life form. But where do these worlds qua life forms come from? They are not merely natural or given. They are not of sentient things, rocks, worn shoes, wasps, and termites. Instead, they are constructions whose elements or building blocks are borrowed from none than our world, from humanity as a life form, and our experiences which recognize and make our world's life forms. Having outlined the premises, this presentation takes the idea of life for a world underlying the significance of the Artificial General Intelligence Research Program as a distinctly philosophical enterprise, notwithstanding its technological, or political, or ideological shortcomings. Just the very idea. In fact, as a philosophy that is the intersection of philosophy of life, philosophy of language, and the life of philosophy. In short, philosophy is philosophy reconceived as a view from nowhere and no end. Its task is to systematically constitute and construct life forms or worlds, not alien, unintelligible, nominal worlds, but worlds which are ways of knowing about this world of ours, the human life form, as well as being perspectives or apertures into the space of possibilities of life from a standpoint that is not strictly limited to here and now, but all of our worldly human experience. For that matter, it can be truly seen as a view from nowhere and when. But what are these life or worlds which are constructed from our human life form, from our world as a spring for other worlds? The answer is that they are confused or explicit artificial machines. I say explicitly because our world or form of life is no less artificial or constructible than these life forms, qua worlds. We are all tangled in the maze of language and conception which organize and inform our experiences of ourselves in the world. But for us, the language is taken for granted as something natural and to a certain degree ineffable and pre-logical. The moment we become self-conscious of the nature of language, not as a medium of human communication, but as a vast logical computational framework that can be diversified and constructed out of the bounds of sense, we are in the domain of imagining new languages and hence new life forms. As Wittgenstein remarks, to imagine a life form is to imagine a language. To live as a life form is for its members to share a space of possibilities. Form is a field of possibilities, and language, or what I would call a general artificial language in this sense, is the most expansive space of possibilities, without which the intelligibility of life is voided and its possibilities remain untapped. General artificial languages ought not be imagined as necessarily having words or even tenses. We can imagine them as having explicit logical, computational, or probabilistic properties, such as, for example, a language built on Carnap's logical syntax and logical induction. Indeed, in the fourth chapter of Logical Foundations of Probability, Rodolphe Carnap intimates the prospects of a computer built on the principles of logical syntax and logical induction. Once we attain the consciousness of the fact that imagining language as a space of possibilities is imagining life forms and worlds different than ours, the Heideggerian Lebensraum, living space, will be crumbled at the foot of Lebensformen, life forms. Only artifacts have a history, and only the forms of life have a history rather than a mere nature, which will continue the timeless life of ideas in the Hegelian sense. Living species will perish, but life forms will endure. In line with this dictum, we can think about computers in the most general sense as constructed lenses looking into what humanity, our life form, and our life world is. What is a computer, if not a determination of what the human is not and what it can be? And what it can be from a perspective that is methodically put together by our various informed assumptions and critiques is but a historical template which is disposed to further construction. To this end, this presentation will engage with computers, generally understood along the lines of life forms, language, and world making. In the Nelson Goodmanian sense, ways of world making. Whatever we can ever imagine about other worlds and life forms is based on the critique and construction of the particular life form we possess, the specific actual world we already inhabit. Philosophy is always, however, a view from nowhere and no when, a global recipe to construct other worlds from whose viewpoints our world will be rendered ever smaller and cosmologically myopic. In a nutshell, all philosophy is about is the question of what can be done through life and for life, as the space of possibilities, as inseparable from form. A philosophy that takes as its premise death and extinction is not philosophy, but a self-defeating ideological fixation, a sleight of intellectual hand that once parasitizes on the resources of life form and life as a world that ought to be recognized. For every cognition is a recognition. All such a myth knows about is a life bereft of form, a life that comes as noetically free, just like a tree that is not accompanied by the concept of a tree. Well, what is a tree without the concept of tree? How can we think like a tree to understand what its world can possibly be without having a renewable conception of it, the language it might or might not have? How is it possible to think of life without a form that is neither given nor restricted to the conceptual resources we have at this time to think about life? A nihilist tends to reduce the life form to the question of bare life. There is a life without form, and to the extent that life will extinguish, the nihilist sees extinction as the truth of the human and all life forms. By separating the question of life from its form, by reducing life forms to life, the nihilist does indeed begin his position from the same premise that undergirds the position of a fanatic vitalist, namely the empty idea of life without form, which can be deflated or disenchanted by a nihilist or inflated and enchanted by a vitalist. But if the question of life, as conceived here and now, is a historical illusion rooted in mistaking the incompleteness of our history for a completed totality, then what does it mean to see life as a space of possibilities, not given by what we think of life in our own narrow conception of life as a human life form, but afforded by a formal idea or a concept that stands for a network of different relationships between humans and is thus amenable to reconstruction, i.e. different conceptions of the human. What is important here is that, as Wittgenstein has suggested, words like human and life are not classes of entities that signify actual things or beings. They are not grounded on attributes, fixed properties, or common denominators, which can be added or removed from living beings at whim. In fact, for Wittgenstein, one of the greatest philosophical sins is to understand human and life as categorical concepts. Instead, life and human are formal concepts, which are neither categorical, i.e. pertaining to a particular class, nor fixed. Difference and possibilities of diversification in such concepts arise from their formality rather than from anything extraneous to their form. For example, regardless of differences in attributes and properties, X and Y can be called human as long as they share the same form. As such, both concepts of the human and life remain open instead of being closed under a particular definition. Their openness originates from the fact that they are not predetermined concepts, but complicated networks of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing, or Wittgenstein calls networks of family resemblance, which are not based on a single shared property, but rather can be thought, in his words, as created by spinning a multiplicity of fibers that overlap with each other. Of course, the strength of this thread is not affected by the fact that there is no single fiber that runs through its whole length. Here we can, of course, think of Charles Sanders Peirce's metaphor of the cable, which is not a chain, like the chain of beings. It is rather a cable whose fibers may be ever so slender, provided they are sufficiently numerous and intimately connected. This form of understanding the concept of life and the human is not by any means underdetermined. It is, on the other hand, healthy, anti-essentialist, and anti-foundationalist. It allows us to imagine a life form as a community or a collective whose members don't need to share a class of attributes or a property for them to be counted as representatives of that life form. Furthermore, this view of the concept of the human and life enables us to finally see different classes of life as resting upon nothing more and nothing less than a form qua a field of possibilities, which can be shared and transferred from one member to another, but also be actively engaged as an open source construction within which other life forms and worlds can be imagined and actualized. And what is human if not an open source concept? In this sense, what are computers or logical machines if not other life forms born out of the suppleness of concept networks such as life and the human? And for that matter, extensions of our history in a different class of life rather than the discontinuation of our history. Having cursorily gone through what is at stake here, i.e., the systematic thought of different life forms or different worlds as a very task of philosophy, we can now begin to say that what all life forms will eventually do, the kind of performative task that defines them all, is to imagine and construct what other kinds of life forms will be born out of them. In other words, in living in an intelligible world or a life form, one ends up speculating and ultimately constructing different worlds and life forms which are not unintelligible in principle. I think that I am a human, but in my provincial idea of humanity, I wander across the oceans of time where the concept of human is broken into pieces and is reinvented anew. I cling to this idea that once you become self-conscious of yourself as a representative of a life form rather than mere life, you are on your way to construct other worlds and other life forms. Essentially, you are in the business of artificialization as an explicit project. Section 2, how a life form can reinvent life. Once the first humans, us, were shattered upon the wall of future, a new human was born, half an etching into the stone and half a computer. Its petrified remains lasted for some time and were eventually erased by the vagaries of different ages. Whereas its true form, a computational machine, a form of life, evolved with time and became one with universe, of which it was a part. This is how Olaf Stapledon's novel, Last and First Men, begins and ends. Over the course of 2 billion years from now, now are the first humans. The fact that we are living in the prehistory of intelligence should not be regarded as a debilitating moment of understanding, one that leads to despondency about our fate as humans. As Homo sapiens, namely as a species, we will be subjected to what Thomas Hardy, with a nod to Darwin, has called the mean times, turning us into relics of natural history. And this is Thomas Hardy's quote from A Pair of Blue Eyes. The creature represented but a low type of animal existence. So essentially, this is a moment where basically the term cliffhanger was invented. The hero, Knight, falls off the cliff, and as he's trying to struggle to save his life, he sees a stone. And inside this stone, he sees eyes, a fossil of deep time. So the creature represented but a low type of animal existence. For never in their vernal years had the plains indicated by those numberless slaty layers been traversed by an intelligence worthy of the name. Zoophytes, mollusca, shellfish were the highest developments of those ancient dates. The immense lapses of time each formation represented had known nothing of the dignity of man. They were grand times, but they were mean times too. And mean were their relics. He was to be with the small in his death. So, as I mentioned, as Homo sapiens, we will be subjected to what Thomas Hardy, with a nod to Darwin, has called the mean times, turning into relics of natural history. Yet as a life form, Wittgenstein Lebensform, we as first humans will be replaced by other life forms, not through the course of natural history or deep time, Darwinian deep time, but by the very definition that we are partaking in a life form. To partake in a life form, such as human, means to explore and construct the concept of the human. For a life form is not a species that simply dies, but a flux of life that is determined by the form of its social practices shared among its members. Its perceptual and noetic images of itself are formed by language, which is through and through collectively practiced and shaped. Yet, insofar as the social or cultural practices which constitute the language can evolve or can be reconfigured such that the nature of language changes in the process, a life form can outlive its specific and contingent historical format, such as Homo sapiens as a biological species. Within this thesis on the endurance and the evolution of Lebensformen, life forms, or the idea of the human a la Hegel, there lies the ultimate import of artificial intelligence, not as a technological hubris or a juvenile flight of fancy about the singularity yet to come, but as a systematic investigation of life forms and how they navigate an incomplete historical landscape, which is called the human. 5 dual concepts define artificial intelligence as an investigation of life forms, both from the historical perspective of here and now, and from the perspective of view from nowhere and nowhen, i.e. the possibilities of how life forms can evolve and diversify. These 5 dual concepts are language and computation, language and experience, experience and history, history and wandering in time, namely evolution, life forms and machinic practices. Let's look briefly at how these 5 dual concepts interconnect. We have individual perceptions and experiences of ourselves and the world to the extent that we share a language. We have experiences to the extent that our experiences are fundamentally intersubjective, passing through a common language or languages, which can be interpreted by the community members of a specific language. Every language is constituted at its base by certain social practices or ways of doing and saying, which also determine what we historically see or experience ourselves and the world as X or Y, namely a form of life. Yet these social practices are not any kind of social practices. They are, at the bottom, logical and computational. In nature, the noise, dot, red dots, has no meaning, no organizational capacity for our experiences, unless and until it enters into an interaction between different interlocutors. The essence of this interaction can be understood as a confrontation of elementary actions, hence interaction, between players or agents whose moves establish the rules of a game, which in turn give meanings and context to the sign noises, such as dot, red dots. Similar to how the rules of chess classify what kind of moves chess pieces can perform. Yet, at its basis, the concept of life form is not about established rules to which we are bound. It is embedded in the idea of play. For example, Goodman's toy aesthetics or world making, which hopefully I will unpack it during the question and answers, because I would say I think that it will prolong this presentation. That we share as an activity. If play precedes the game, for example, like a child play with a Lego set. You know, a Lego set, you know, these Lego kits that comes like a Death Star, and you have it for your birthday in 1982, and you are never going to make a Death Star as a child. You are actually making dragons, kitchen out of it, right? So if play precedes the game, and if life form is more on the side of play and tinker toys than games and their rules, then to inhabit a life form means to play around with the form and the world, to reinvent them as new life forms and world versions. We can imagine this computational or machinic conception of social practices which form our individual and historical experiences might actually lead to ever more generalized forms of language with higher expressive powers and computational capacities. In line with this postulate, we can further imagine new life forms or constructs of 2 vectors of reformatting of the Homo sapiens, one from below and the other from the above. respectively, the reconfiguration of our particular natural history by artificial means, such that, for example, the human brain is reconstructed by more powerful statistical and neural models, as we are seeing today. And then the substitution of our language, natural language, and its conceptual inferential resources by languages with explicit logical and computational properties. It is through the intertwinement of these two vectors, i.e. artificialization from below, from sensation up to cognition, and then from cognition to sensation, from the top, that we can conjecture about machinic life forms, whose histories are the continuation of the idea of the human, yet unburdened by our immature history. Thinking otherwise would mean that we do indeed restrict the notion of history as a time of the idea of the human to our particular instantiation as humans here and now. And thus we implicitly endorse the well-worn dictum, the Aristotelian dictum, that Homo sapiens is the apex of history. In other words, we end up confounding natural history, which is always contingent with regard to a life form, with the artificial history of what it means to be human, to construct human and explore the networks of what Wittgenstein would have called the networks of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing, family resemblances. Natural history may be unbound, but it is not a history as such. Its unboundedness is blind to what life forms come and go. Whereas an idea, with capital I, example, that what it means to be human is thoroughly a construct, an artifact. Yet only life forms have a notion of history. To have a history, one has to have a concept of oneself and the world. And to have a concept, one must have a public language. It is in this sense that the gradual machinic transformation of our particular social practices, which constitute the form of our life, and through which our notion of history is shaped, coincides with an unbound history, which is the history of the idea, and not beings or a species. Life forms, in this sense, should strictly be conceived as machines, because only machines, whether supported by synthetic, organic, inorganic, or purely inorganic structures, retain an idea, or in this case, the concept of the human, given the fact that they are constructible. You cannot identify the idea of the machine unless you have a system of construction, just like human. Everything that intimates natural entities or a species will capitulate to the Darwinian deep time at the end of the day. It will become a fossil as an omen of indifferent mean times. The question of what it means to be human has always been the question of what it means to be a machine as a construction system. A constructible constellation whose history is as vast of the possibilities of its reconstruction and recognitions. Machinic life forms, of which we are a rudimentary exemplification, see their histories as a systematic navigation or wandering in the dense forests of time, where rainbows change their colors, where trees are at once green and blue, grew, Nelson Goodman's projection grew, and where any earth home is always descending into an abyss called cosmological possibilities, into the field or form of life which is beyond what is now the case. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Reza. It has been a fantastic talk, and I think I'm going to start with one question, and then I'll maybe pass around.
Sure, absolutely.
Se qualcuno volesse fare una domanda in italiano di qualsiasi tipo, posso tradurla io e chiederla successivamente a Reza. So I'll start with a couple of questions which I think can intersect quite well with our seminar in general. First off, there's a quite strong Heideggerian lineage of thought in the organizers of this seminar. Some of us were.
I pretend that I didn't hear that.
What I wanted to ask you about this is, could you maybe explain further the problem with a philosophy that starts from death as a sort of ontological prime mover, and elaborate on that?
And then, it's essentially it's actually a quite a simple formula that philosophers have whitewashed over the course of history. You see, death is not a blow to a life form, because a life form is life as conceived by a form, and a form is enduring, like the idea of the human in a Hegelian sense, right? It is not just a species. It's not just about matter and natural objects and entities, right? So death is only giving the hardest blow, the ultimate blow, to what you might call to be a life bereft of form. It can kill all sorts of natural objects in time, right? But what about the life form? Essentially, to in fact realize the fact of death, the inevitable fact of death, as the ultimate blow to basically the vagaries of a species and beings, but also to understand that life, the concept of life without form is an empty idea. With these two understandings, then how can death can be taken as a premise? If not, you're already smuggling the idea of pure life into the equation, just like a vitalist. Because if your premise was a life form, then you couldn't posit death as the premise or as the ultimate ground.
Yeah, I think this kind of intersects pretty well with the second question, which I think you kind of see coming. I believe that the Heideggerians, in this sense, has a sort of strong point about death. When they talk about death, they are also talking about alterity and otherness, and they are sort of, how can I say it? They are putting a sort of transcendence into life. So life is meaningful.
Transcendence or transcendence?
Transcendence as otherness, I'd say. So they can kind of justify the idea that there's a form to human, an authentic form to human life via this sort of transcendence through death. So understanding this gives me a sort of computational power to see myself as a species, whatever. It kind of discloses this possibility to put myself above natural history, in a sense.
Yes, at the same time, I would say that making this move, yes, absolutely, it allows you to have a certain kind of recognition of yourself as a life form, right? Like humans. But I would say that at the end of the day, it's quite parochial, precisely because it entitles you, it allows you to recognize yourself as human, but it does not allow you to reconstruct the concept of human, precisely because the human is no longer within this idea. You see, Hegel has a great idea that any philosophy that starts with finitude is a bad philosophy. It's a sick philosophy. It's ridden with disease. So if you think that death actually applies to the concept of human, then you're obviously at some point eliding the distinction, making a weaselly move to conflate the distinction between human as being and human as a formal concept, or Hegel's idea. Now, within the domain of death, yes, human as a species will absolutely, as I mentioned, will perish, becomes a fossil. But in the domain of the idea, death doesn't apply to it. In fact, it is only through the idea that we can arrive at the fact of death. How else can we see death as opposed to life?
Yeah, I kind of see your point. I understand where you're coming from, and I understand your critique. But I would like to ask, like, the final question, which is going to be pretty harsh. Don't you think it's a little problematic to sort of put a deep cut in natural history and say, here's the human, which is a form, which is not bound to its disappearance from the planet, and then there's the rest. There's the other life forms which are bound to disappear, but they do not know that they're.
That's not what I said. I actually mentioned quite specifically that by life forms, I don't mean, you know, a tree. There is a squirrel out there, I can see it in the yard. I don't mean these kinds of stuff. They are not life forms. Life forms are only life forms by virtue of having the consciousness of their form. And that form is only given by through language, logic. So from this perspective, it is not as if I am saying that, there are life forms out there, and also we are life forms, and there is a deep cut, as you said it, within our natural history that suddenly we became, conscious of the form. No, that is not. In fact, I'm completely opposed to this kind of what you might call to be pseudo-Platonistic. I would say that Plato would have never actually come up with this idea. I would call it, that's why I call it a pseudo-Platonic idea. That there is a deep cut in the natural history. No. The first thing is that, so the furniture of language have been afforded to us by way of natural processes, right? But it would be a total mistake to confuse the natural evolution of language with what actually language can do or possibly can perform. These are two different things. And that's the whole idea of Hegelian self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is the moment that you are given a certain kind of what Hegel calls the Dasein of the Geist. And that the sign of Geist, even though it has evolved naturally, nevertheless allows us to see things, to actually see the natural evolution. Because otherwise, without it, there wouldn't be any concept of natural evolution, deep cuts, so on and so forth. It would be, I would say, absurd to think that we could, in fact, think about Darwinian deep time without the formal resources of our systematic theorizations in sciences.
Qualcuno vuole fare una domanda?
In realtà si lega abbastanza alla domanda che hai fatto tu, cioè mi sembra un po' problematica questa discontinuità così forte tra la forma di vita umana caratterizzata da questa coscienza, autoconsapevolezza, e il non umano, inteso non tanto come l'intelligenza artificiale, dove la continuità in realtà è molto chiara, mi sembra sia un po' appunto del tuo discorso, ma come animalità non umana, eccetera. Lui ha parlato di queste forme di vita come in continua evoluzione e diversificazione tramite quello che è definito linguaggio e computazione, o linguaggio inteso proprio come computazione. E mi chiedevo in che misura questa cosa non si possa estendere all'evoluzione intesa in senso biologico, nel momento in cui estendiamo la nostra concezione di linguaggio in modo un po' più...
Di diversificazione del linguaggio, intendi?
Se in generale questo processo di evoluzione e di diversificazione delle forme di vita possa essere applicato in qualche modo, riconfigurando.
Cioè che se c'è una continuità fra le leggi naturali.
Esatto.
Okay, so they're doubling down on my question. What they're saying is that they also find problematic this strong distinction between a sort of natural history and an artificial intelligence, so to speak, because as they say, there's like this problem where you have natural history, which is diversifying also basically by itself, and there's a sort of continuity. And then all the life forms you talk about, the sort of conceptual forms, which are kind of grown out of, you know, artificial intelligence, where the continuity is clear, but there seems to be a sort of rupture between natural laws and the laws of language, logic, computation, and so forth. And what they're asking,
there are anything such. There is no such a thing as laws of language. There are rules, and rules are constructible. Whereas laws of nature basically are certain kinds of theoretically derived invariances, right? So the thing is that it's not that as if I am making a fundamental distinction between natural history and to have a history in the sense of Levin's formula. I think that, so nevertheless, I am completely against Daniel Dennett's position, because Daniel Dennett's position in Darwin, The Dangerous Idea, is exactly like that. So essentially, natural evolution is being seen as algorithms, you know, self-correcting algorithms that basically create a design space. Essentially, that's what evolution is. It's a design space within which algorithms, you know, clash and rectify one another. But the thing is that, yeah, I'm pro the idea of design space, but I think that it is fundamentally a very naive physicalistic thesis to think that first you could actually arrive at the concept of algorithm without certain kinds of, you know, refinable rules within language, either natural or formal, or that simply by virtue that rules are undergirded by constraints of natural laws are reducible to them. That I would call just basically 101 physicalistic fallacy.
So there's like you think there's a sort of heterogeneous nature between the laws and the rules of logic, the laws of nature and the rules of logic, because the rules of logic are constructible. So there's a sort of...
Yes, and the origin is not really nature as such, but as Wittgenstein would have said, life forms, language games, interactions.
Qualche altra domanda? Sì, certo.
Se possiamo pensare al concetto umano, le norme che definiscono il concetto umano attraverso altre norme, queste norme avranno ovviamente un punto di vista che è dal punto di vista del nostro projetico. Se questo è volutamente un plauso, dal punto di vista projetico, e se questo in qualche modo non è in contrasto con l'idea di creare una filosofia che possa essere tendenzialmente rivolta solo al benessere di tutti.
Okay. So what they're asking is, it's a really interesting question. What they're saying is, when you say that rules, that human coincides with the sort of rules he makes for himself. So, and rules are based on other constructible rules, so to speak. So therefore, rules come from a sort of anthropocentric point of view. So it's other humans and other intersubjective relations which construct rules for one another. The question is, don't you think that this clashes with what we could call a post-human philosophy, a philosophy which takes into account a wider set of agents and a sort of a politics for everybody, so to speak?
First of all, if I remember that I quite emphasize on this point at the middle of the presentation, that humans are not divided by rules. Rules are more like historical ossifications of what can possibly be done within a community of life forms, as Wittgenstein would have said it. So essentially, as I said, play precedes the rules. Life forms are more like play, whereas this rather totalized image of the human is the ossification of the kind of rules that we have historically applied to ourselves, right? But if we go back and see the very idea where the concept of human unfolds, a la Wittgenstein, as a network of family resemblances, then we are in the business of play. It's essentially, we have the same thing in, for example, Jean-Yves Girard's idea that logic should not be understood by way of rules. Rather, we have to invent or discover the logic of rules, how rules come about and basically are applied to different things. So within that sense, I think that, yes, there is definitely a difficulty here. So we have one human in a Wittgensteinian sense, which is not closed under a definition and is more of a play, world building, constructing life forms. And the other is what you might call to be the ossification, the historical ossification of plays into rules or games, which impart, certain kind of constraints of what we can do or what we cannot. I think that we cannot simply take side with one or another. It would be ahistorical to simply go for this idea of free play concept of human. And it would be myopically historical as a totalization, achieved or completed totalization, to take for granted the idea of human practices as defined by the kind of rules that have been given to us historically. I would say that we have to oscillate between these two. Any sort of, bipolarization here will lead into unwanted consequences. Bad post-humanism, bad humanism, all sorts of stuff.
So I'm gonna sort of go back on this because I think it's very interesting. If you could maybe talk a little more about game, like what do you mean by play, the primacy of play, maybe just a little bit, because I know that your philosophy is very wide on this and it's been a central.
The concept of play, I would say that one of the greatest philosophers who actually has thought about it, other than Wittgenstein, late Wittgenstein, is Nelson Goodman. You see, Nelson Goodman sees, for Nelson Goodman, there is no undergirding reality. So he's an irrealist, right? The reason that he denounces the concept of an undergirding or final reality is precisely because he says quite explicitly that, okay, so people who are actually, go for idea of a fundamental reality or stuff out there, usually are modal realists. All they want is that, okay, so the kind of structures that we project onto reality, they need to have a target system. You need to have some stuff out there to which you project the structure, right? But he says, which I'm quite fond of this, but I need to think about this even more. It says that this concept of underlying reality or stuff is the most useless concept philosophy has ever invented. Because reality should be ontologically neutral. So if otherwise you basically find yourself in the business of the myth of the given, right? So if reality is neutral, then why do you need to add it to the equation? On the basis of the principle of parsimony, right? You don't need to add this kind of bloatware, metaphysical bloatware, to your, basically claims that you make. So the notion of reality is out of the window. But the second horn of basically Goodman's dilemma is that what we call reality is in fact the labor of projection, or what he calls projectables. Essentially, there is no such a thing as reality out there. We project our predicates, like green and blue, onto the stuff out there, and that's how we see a reality. But then we can also think about creating different projections or projectables, such as, his famous example. So usually we say that all emeralds are green before time t1, after a hypothetical future time t2, based on observations that we have, all emeralds shall be considered as green. Now, Nelson Goodman says that no, this is just stupid idea. You can, in fact, come up with a different predicate, a toy predicate, precisely because it's a form of play. That all emeralds before time t1 are green, and afterwards, and observe, and afterwards they are blue. It's not that emerald for some reason, some radioactive reason has changed its color. No, no, no. It's just that you can apply these predicates like this. And it is as legitimate and even more accurate than the predicate green. Grew is more accurate than the predicate green. The only reason that we are not using it precisely because we are habituated to a space of rules, of perceptions and conceptions. We are acclimatized to the predicate green and the rules that instantiate it and allows us to apply it rather than the more accurate and complex predicate grew. So you see, this is the kind of difference between rule, game, and play. Grew on the side of play, green on the side of the rule. Wittgenstein, I would say, and even late Goodman, they try to invert this equation by saying that, in fact, rules of a game are ossifications, cultural ossifications of certain kinds of free plays. The reason that we are using green is precisely because we have habituated to certain kind of constructabilities of a play, free play, and now we take them as rules, and hence a game.
Yeah, I'm gonna just go with another question because I think it's pretty interesting. A lot of people do not know your philosophy right now, and my introduction was very, very quick. But I said that you are sort of an offshot of the so-called speculative realism. But what you just said is it's the polar opposite of, I don't know, Maurizio Ferrari's new realism. Could you maybe say a little bit about your relation to speculative realism and your actual philosophy and how you came to these positions?
Yes. Well, it is kind of a little bit hard, but I try to my best. Essentially, you know, it was not as if I basically identified myself as a speculative realist. I was bunched together with a bunch of other people who actually didn't agree on the idea of a speculative realism. I think that speculative realism from the start was misguided. So essentially, it's a number of people who are disagreeing, who are agreeing on the flaws of certain kind of philosophical trajectory from Kant onwards, right? But to share disagreement doesn't mean that you are having agreements, right? And this became quite obvious between Ray Brusier, Graham Harman, Ian Hamilton Graham and Quentin Masu. But I would say that there is still something that can be recuperated from speculative realism. But my version is this, that the idea of a speculation is still worth entertaining. Speculating not as whimsical imagination about Popeye, lava lamps, vacuum sealed garbage bags with objects inside them. No, no. Something more like a Hegelian idea of a speculation. So What Hegel meant by speculation is to suspend the immediacy of the state of affairs. And it's the task of philosophy to do that. Isn't it the whole idea of the view from nowhere and nowhere? To think beyond the immediacy of the state of affairs. Marx, communism is also, in that sense, is speculative, fundamentally. Why, I mean, in German ideology, Marx and Engels identify communist hypothesis with the understanding that it's a real movement that suspends or abolishes the current state of affairs, the order of things, right? So this is what speculation is. A good example that I have for you within the history of science about how a speculation might look like is the history of lens making. So Galileo made a perfect lens, you know, and he made a telescope looking into the sky above. Spinoza was, you know, a little bit more interesting, and Kepler used Spinoza's model. He was, you know, basically his lens was made by hand, so it had flaw. And Kepler noticed something really interesting, that certain kind of lenses that have imperfections can actually reveal something more about depth of celestial bodies. But he didn't understand the whole principle. Huygens finally sealed the deal, paving the road for Newtonian revolution, in the sense that he made two perfect lenses. But these lenses were non-arbitrarily, in fact intentionally, were made by certain kinds of tractable, investigatable flaws. And he put these two lenses together, made a telescope. What this telescope did is that it shadowed the rims of the telescope. So you are looking, you know, from a circle, you are looking into the skies. So on the rim, every object is blurred in shadows. This blurring allows you to focus on something deeper. This is what a speculation is. And his name of telescope was a speculum telescope.
So we could say that there's a question about, I'm going to just add a thing because you told me this story so many times that I have to add it. I mean, you could say that speculation is actually not a purposeful, but a useful misreading of whatever happens, a sort of useful aberration.
Yes, not only useful, but tractable. Precisely because Spinoza's, you know, handmade lenses had so many flaws that you couldn't actually track what is going wrong with this lens, right? The whole point is tractability. You can basically trace what is actually going wrong before arriving what is right.
Yeah, there's one question.
Sì, io in realtà non ho capito bene una cosa, però è anche una domanda. Cioè, se lui definisce una forma di vita quale uno spazio di condivisione e di possibilità di questo incontro di sé e vissute, e poi propone anche il suo progetto di indagare sistematicamente, no, le forme di vita, questo al fine di, è già qui la prima domanda, ridefinire o costruire un nuovo concetto di umano, in quanto noi, in quanto rappresentanti consapevoli, in un certo senso, dell'intelligibilità delle forme di vita, eccetera. Allora, la prima domanda è: come puoi dire poi che questo caratterizzi la filosofia come uno sguardo da nessuna parte e da nessun luogo, e io posso anche comprendere quando diciamo, cioè, ossia, come posso togliere di mezzo il fatto che, citando, cioè, io sono l'ente per cui emerge un senso nel mondo, io, da questa affermazione, posso anche capire che gli semantizzi il senso come gioco, però anche un gioco, per essere tale, deve avere una regola, per cui anche lo sguardo da nessuna parte e da nessun tempo non è forse il tentativo di costruire un concetto che tolga di mezzo ciò che io già sempre sto facendo. Quindi la mia domanda è: quanta voglia c'è di costruire un nuovo concetto di umano, quanto piuttosto di vedere chiaramente cosa l'uomo è?
Okay, it's a rather big one, the phenomenologist. So,
That's quite like
okay, the question is, so you sort of exposed this philosophy of play, and but you also said that this philosophy of play, this philosophy of rule-based games, it's a point of view from nowhere and no when.
Play, not rule making. Rule making is always here and now.
Okay.
Play precedes rules. It's essentially the whole idea that, for example, we as humans are life forms, but we tend to actually conflate our life form with the apex of the class of entities, such as beings, Aristotelian flaw.
And that's exactly where the question is going, because the question
Yes.
is, okay, it's very precise on this point, and I think it makes a great critique of the concept of a point of view from nowhere and no when, because from the moment you're saying that we are sort of inspecting the ossification of the rules which led us here, in a sense, you're always doing it from a very specific point of view. You're always doing it as...
Absolutely. That's the whole point. As I mentioned, that you see, you cannot make worlds out of blue. New worlds are not just like alien entities, unicorns out there, butterflies, like dragons. Every sort of world that we can ever make is from the ingredients of our worlds. But so there is a kind of a double movement here. One, we accede to the fact that every world that can be made, no matter how different, is made from the ingredients of our own worlds, of our own games, right, and rules. That's one. Two, but then how can we simply go from ossify the rules of our games to make new worlds? That's not possible. We have to go back to the origin of where the rules came from, which is play. And that's what I call world making.
Because the question was actually, how can you say that this is a point of view from nowhere and no when, if you're talking from a very specific phenomenological and also existential position? Yeah, if you're talking about my rules and my ossified history, how is this? How can you?
The moment that we create a different life form, namely a world, we are in the business of a view from nowhere and nowhere, relative to the world of here and now that we do inhabit. Let me tell you a good example of this in the history of science. The earth moves versus the earth is at rest. Obviously, from the history of science perspective, the Copernican formula of earth moves versus Ptolemaic claim or statement that earth is at rest, there is no big gap between them. Copernicus simply corrected the world of Ptolemaic. But look at these two statements. They are contradictory, in fact.
Yeah, because I think there's also, you know, the hysterical problem which was raised here is that there's a great difficulty of saying, how can I speak from nowhere and know when? There is a sort of practical impossibility, I'd say, to actually
You can
assume.
say, if I can talk about it, you only construct something with a broader, you know, scope of statements, consistencies, truths, and then from the perspective of that world, you might say that this is a view from nowhere and no when with regard to the older world. Just like the Copernican statement that Earth moves according to the heliocentric frame, the Earth moves with regard to the frame of reference. According to the geocentric frame of reference, the Earth is at rest.
Yeah, because this sort of had a second question nested within it. And the question was, which I think you also kind of already answered to it, if you'd rather construct new worlds or inspect the ossified rules and laws which actually are like behind our back in a sense.
That's a really fantastic question. I really need to think about it. But I would say that Wittgenstein probably would have said that construction is a very organon of investigation. So has Carnap. Literally, you cannot investigate without constructing. I mean, isn't it really the whole point of Carnap's cursed book, Aufbau, Logical Structure of the World? I mean, many people who are unfamiliar with Carnap think that basically the point of, and he's not positivist really, he's logical empiricist. It's that, you know, he's trying to create some foundations for how possibly experience can be thought or reconstructed, logically reconstructed. But this is absolutely not true. Erlebs, or what he calls elementary experiences, are just like pre-theoretical slices of experience, simply denominated by space and time coordinates, and a sort of, you know, family resemblances and so on and so forth, and from which he tries to construct experience to the extent that Carnap actually claims that you cannot talk about experience if you haven't managed to logically reconstruct it.
Yeah, so the question is not either or, but it's
Yes.
both of them.
Yes, yes.
So I'll go with a final one just to sort of reconstruct your philosophy, because we didn't have the chance to actually delve into it. Now you're a universalist, a rationalist, a Wittgensteinian, a Carnapian, but how does cyclonopedia fit into all of this? Is there a way you think there's a sort of coherent structure to your philosophy, or is there actually, as in Wittgenstein, two different authors writing two different books, which might converge on some points, but are actually extremely different?
Sure. My first impulse would be say that absolutely it has nothing to do with me. I didn't even write this book, but I think I need to be, you know, honest with myself, and I would say that yes, cyclonopedia is born out of this certain kind of, you know, this kind of construction, even though the construction is flawed ultimately, but it is essentially a constructive work that through a construction of certain kinds of, you know, fictional premises, you see how, for example, the Middle East or geostrategical positions are unfolding. So in that sense, yes, I would say that, in fact, all of my philosophical life, I have believed in construction, but I just didn't take it as an explicit fact. The whole idea that construction is nothing but investigation and critique is nothing but construction.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. We're done. Thank you so much.
Have a great day, and thank you so much again for all your hospitality. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.